Our state has some incredible problems. My name is Lynn Hinderrocker. I'm here to talk about that with you and talk about the trends that have shaped this state and dragged us in one direction or another. We're not really we're not realizing the dream we had way back in the early 2000s or even around 2008 or 9 or 10. My name is Lynn Hinderrocker. Welcome to WOWBIZ Nebraska. We're going to get it on right now. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. Those are the first two sentences inside of Tale of Two Cities. That may apply to the state of Nebraska here today. Thanks for joining us here at WOWBIZ Nebraska. I'm Lynn Hinderrocker, and that's why I'm visiting with Brian Sloan from the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. Brian, a real pleasure to have you here, sir.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me. Now, why do you think I said that? Do you think that's applicable, best of times, worst of times? Well, what's your state of the union right now in 30 seconds or less, insofar as the state is
30-second is we all know the challenges that the state has.
Yeah.
We're not growing fast enough.
Right.
And we're not as competitive as we'd like to be. And yet the things that are happening in the global and national economy really are working to our favor if we're strategic about it. From our water resources to geography doesn't matter anymore in terms of technology, to a host of other things we'll talk about.
Yeah.
Nebraska has some real chances to move up the competitiveness ladder right now.
You're very optimistic about the future, but you acknowledge the fact that it's been a struggle. The last 2 years in particular have been a rough time. Now, we're going to talk today a little bit about this thing called Blueprint Nebraska, which you and Jim Smith are kind of heading up. And it's what a challenge it is. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about what is this? I know in chatting with people, a lot of people just don't know yet. So how do you describe Blueprint Nebraska?
Yeah, so what Blueprint Nebraska is really a grassroots effort to develop an economic strategy for Nebraska. And it's almost embarrassing that here we are, an $8 billion government institution in a much, much bigger state from an economic standpoint. And we really don't have an overall economic strategy in a world where all 50 states are competing against each other. Not just the 50 states, we're competing against foreign countries for the same customers right now.
Right.
And so it's a bottom-up effort to really develop an overall economic strategy for the state.
And when you got the opportunity to sit down and discuss this thing called Blueprint Nebraska, what was your gut reaction? I can knock this out, this will be great? Or was it, how in the world am I ever going to do this? And it's a massive, complex job that's probably undoable. What was your gut reaction to the overall notion of readjusting and redefining our economic future?
Well, I think you get excited about the prospect that we actually might be able to accomplish this and move forward. At the same time, I think we're all a little cynical. The word initiative to me, over the years, I've become a little cynical when somebody has an initiative. What got me excited about this one was from the get-go, the design was, how do we get hundreds of people across the state involved? And once people started talking about that, I got pretty excited about this was not a bunch of wise people trying to say, here's what you should do and everybody else follow. This was really a grassroots effort to come to a conclusion that worked not only in Omaha, but in Scottsbluff and Valentine and North Platte and everywhere else.
Exactly right, and that's the exciting part of it. But our state is like every state, by the way, is an agglomeration of different types and different worldviews and so on. Talk to us a little bit about that part of this challenge. How do we pull people together and are we really divided and by what? Why don't you elaborate on that if you can?
Yeah, so just as background, I grew up in the western part of the state primarily.
Yeah.
Went to school in Lincoln and have lived in Omaha for 20 years, so I've covered the gamut.
Right. We should mention, by the way, you're an international globetrotter as well.
And I lived internationally as well.
In Berlin, right?
Yes, in Berlin.
Okay.
But what I would say is, while we think there are great differences in our state, the answer is our differences aren't really that great. Our greatest resources are people, and we're fairly united around things. I mean, you go to other places in the world, and the difference between points of view is much greater.
Much more dramatic.
Absolutely.
Interesting. Does the aquifer beneath much of Nebraska, is that really the core long-term asset for this particular state? I'm cutting to the chase.
I would say it's a second asset.
Okay. Next to the people.
Number one asset, and we always say that, but I really mean it. For those of us who've lived in other places around the world, There is nothing like the people in this state, and it's something that occurred from the 1880s forward. This mentality of just getting things done and the work ethic that's in this state. But clearly the second most important resource is water. As we see a number of states start to dry out, Texas, California, big industrial states. And I always say we sit on the biggest puddle in the world. I mean, we have the greatest water resource available right now.
But we really don't have it. This is going down to a segment here of this conversation, but we don't really have a strategy for that water other than protect it and make sure it doesn't get polluted. At this point, that's pretty much it, isn't it?
We have a bit of a strategy, but what I think we need is a lot more sort of forward-looking 20, 30 years. How important is this water resource going to be? How are we going to protect it? How we're going to make sure it's still available to agriculture, but also to recreation and other things in the state. There's a lot of people already working on that in this state, but we need a much more concrete strategy.
Okay, let's go back to the top of Blueprint Nebraska for just a second and explain the role you have relative to other people, from the governor all the way down. So help us understand the structure of it and get into the committees and so on, so we kind of understand how you're pulling all this together.
So how this came together, so Blueprint Nebraska came from Hank Bounds, who's the president of the University of Nebraska.
Right.
He came from the University of Mississippi, where he'd worked on with the governor there a similar blueprint process. When he brought this idea to Governor Ricketts here in Nebraska, they both agreed this was something that had to be done, and to their credit, they both concluded this had to be done, though, from a grassroots level involving the business community.
Right.
This couldn't be a university project, this couldn't be the governor's project and be a political project. This had to be something that was grassroots within the business community. So they formed a steering committee. So at the top of this is a steering committee of about 20 business people, prominent business people from all over the state.
Okay.
The actual organization is headed by former Senator Jim Smith, who we all know, who is a very capable person. He's the executive director of Blueprint Nebraska, but the steering committee is this executive body. Underneath that is 16 or so councils. Each of those councils have 10 to 12 people on it, and they will take a specific segment, maybe an industry like agriculture, or there's a segment on community vitality. How do we make sure that these communities that we have in this state continue to be relevant and continue to attract young people?
Yes. And that really is kind of where I wanted to go in this dialogue. I mean, how do we know if we've succeeded? Now, I realize that's a complex topic and there's never an end point. But insofar as attracting this demographic and keeping the state vital with new blood and young blood, tell me a little bit about that. Are we at a complete loss? Are we going to just attack it and see where it goes? You know, we obviously have flat land. We don't have rocks. We don't have mountains. We don't have oceans. We have 4 seasons a year. Some people don't necessarily love the cold weather. So we have a couple geographic things. Tell me a little bit about that and that economic development image challenge as it relates to this younger demo.
No, this is important because the states that are going to win economically going forward are the states that can attract 20 and 30-year-olds right now. And you and I have to be a little bit careful. We don't need a couple of old guys talking about what the state needs to attract 20 and 30-year-olds. But I know we both have some opinions on that, and so I'd be interested in your opinions as well. But from my standpoint, again, I come from the Sandhills, so I'll admit we don't have oceans, but we've got hundreds of miles of beach. We have...
I knew we were going to dip into the metaphorical part of your brain eventually, but go ahead.
We had to get there. But no, we have tremendous recreational opportunities in Nebraska. We need to continue to develop them.
Yes.
And I'll give you an example, like a Lake McConaughey out in Ogallala.
All right.
Fabulous recreational opportunity out there. It's been a great lake. It was a lake that I fished on growing up. But we could do a lot more to develop Ogallala and Lake McConaughey from an economic engine standpoint, and also make that a magnet for younger people who are really looking for more recreational opportunity in their daily life.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. That's a tremendous resource. We just visited recently with David Sawyer, who's a economic development person up in Burwell, and Burwell has done particularly well with agritourism. And I actually had to, and I come from the farm. I actually had to ask him, what is agritourism? Because to me, standing in a cornfield and looking around doesn't seem like it'd be that entertaining. But I was kidding, of course, and he was very proud of the track record they have in that area. But do you think that plays a role? And can we get people involved in actually liking that, caring about that?
Yeah. So you know, what I love about this generation is sometimes frustrating to our generation.
Yeah.
Is this is a generation that asks why.
Yeah.
Why do we do things like we do? Why? Can I do it more efficiently? Can I create a better lifestyle and work-life balance by doing it a different way?
Sure.
And most of the time they're correct. They just have different habits than you and I have, but they're just as anxious to develop in their careers, but they're also very family-oriented. So when they ask why, they also ask it about their lifestyle. And when they're sitting on that train in New York or that bus in Chicago,
See, my kids are waiting for me. This will
my
be
kids
another
are
hour
waiting
before
for me.
I'm home.
There is a moment, because I've lived that life.
So have I.
I've lived that life, and you sit on that train and you say, you know, there's a better way.
Yeah.
And Burwell is a better way.
Yeah, well.
As is Scotts Bluff, as is Alliance, as is Valentine. There is something for everybody here, and there's a quality of life here that's really different. And this I want a generation that asks the question why,
Sure.
in terms of quality of life.
Absolutely. Do you think it's a moral thing or an environmental kind of a design thing where they like to be surrounded, or is it a time-oriented thing? Let's dive into this for just a couple minutes. How is this generation that we're so interested in populating our state with, make sure they don't leave, God forbid, what is really driving them? Are they reacting to the fact that their baby boomer parents worked their butts off and didn't really maybe get rewarded the way they thought they would? Are they reacting against a previous generation's assumptions, or are they taking it from or are they mixing it all together and developing their own eclectic belief system? Could be from the East, could be from the West, and personalizing their value system on their own.
You're going to accuse me of being a lawyer, which I am at this point, by giving you, say, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So I think every generation reacts in opposition to its prior generation. So my generation, very much our parents were Depression babies. And they don't, there's a reason they call it the greatest generation, because it was. Mm-hmm. It just absolutely was. Mm-hmm. But our generation, the parenting, there was lots of demands and structure around how we were parented.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? Our generation reacted by not putting so much structure around how we parented.
That's right.
And so this generation looks at life differently than sort of our unstructured world. They want a lot more structure in their world, and they really want a lot more purpose to what they do on a daily basis. That is a reaction to parents. The second piece that's not sort of generational is the effects of technology on how we live day to day.
Yeah.
And they live in a virtual world where things have to move like this. And so you've got to create environments where there's lots of things to do.
And convenience and a lot of cultural options. That's right. Another area that we struggle with. Do we redefine things that we have right in front of us and say, well, this is culturally cool. You want to do this, like agritourism, or do we bring them and do we literally put some energy and resources into, how do I say this? I don't want to say redesigning the state, but adding some of these things to the state and tangibly making it more attractive to them as a result.
What I love about this state is how accessible this state is to people. If you are interested in agriculture, it's absolutely accessible. If you're interested in engineering, if you're interested in transportation, if you're interested in finance, it's very accessible in a way that if I was, for instance, interested in becoming an investment banker,
yeah.
For me to go to New York and make that career work is really a 20-year experience.
A lot of barriers.
Whereas in Omaha, there's some incredible financial investment institutions where I can develop and I can have a lot of experiences earlier. Same in agriculture.
Yeah, no, I understand. Is it really just come down to the fact that there's fewer people here, so it's a lot easier to stand out and do something big because there's just fewer people? Is that possibly what we're just talking about here? Because South Dakota and Iowa, they would have the same strengths, relative strengths.
I think you get a lot more coaching and mentoring in this state as well. So I think that even goes back to our rural roots, where if somebody was raising a barn or they were branding or whatever, all the neighbors participated. You see it in the entrepreneurial community here.
Yes.
Is the willingness to help.
Yeah.
Even people that are going to be your competitors down the road.
Yeah.
The willingness to help that I don't see when I go to New York or I go to LA or I go to Chicago.
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point. You know, I'm going to ask you this question. It's a loaded question. If you were talking to every single business owner or senior executive in the state of Omaha right now, and somebody said, tell us what we have to do to increase our GDP here in this state, 20%. 20%, okay, as opposed to 2 or 3. Do you have a ready answer? Because I do.
So give me a timetable, 20% in this year, 5 years, 10 years?
Quickly, you know, maybe 5 years.
Yeah, so I think what we could do very quickly, because GDP for us is very much people-driven at this point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The great limiter on our GDP growth is people, not technology, not capital.
Right.
It's people. And so number one thing I would do is create a marketing campaign today to bring...
You're talking my language
To
here.
do 2 things. There's a group of Nebraskans out there, and it's in the numbers of the tens to over 100,000, who have Nebraska connections that are working someplace else and are unhappy with their situation.
You know that last part, by the way? You know that
Yes,
last part? Okay.
and let's bring them home.
Okay.
The second piece is we have a number of Nebraskans who are unemployed or underemployed that need just a little effort, and that number is over 100,000.
Okay.
And so there's some real opportunity to make some big workforce changes fairly shortly by focusing on a specific group of people out there who could be really instrumental to what we want to do. But I'm interested in your ideas.
Well, I would, there's so many established family businesses in the state, many of them owned by baby boomers or whatever, and they've been somewhat successful over the years, you know, and so on. But what's happened, and you know this, is that we fall into some kind of a pattern. As long as the money's rolling in and the employees are around and we're meeting payroll, we're saving a little money, we just kind of just go with the flow. And meanwhile, the world changes. We try to get these young folks involved with our companies. They're a little bit reluctant to get in, but you get a few of them involved, and they look around and they're ready to go home at 4:59. And the answer to the question then is to make all these existing states, existing companies, intrapreneurial. In other words, you find the entrepreneurial types, the resourceful, creative types, the types that want to head up a task force or a committee or whatever it is. You resource them, put them outside the building and let them come up with a new product or service that kind of works with what you're currently doing, and really inject the spirit of intrapreneurialism into existing firms. I think there'd be a quick jump. In 18 months, I think we'd hatch a lot of new things.
I agree with you, but can I put sort of 2 overlays on that?
Yeah.
So one of the overlays I want to put on that is, which goes to the question of this next generation.
Yeah.
So my generation is very much, and we learned this from our parents' generation, if I'm going to be successful, I'm just going to pound more hours than the next guy.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And that never works, as you know. And so some of the most successful people we know get it done, and they get it done in 8 or 9 hours a day. What they've done is really organize their lives and structured their business in a way, and let's face it, 10% of we've got 1 million people employed in the state, plus or minus, plus. 10% are salespeople. And so even though I practiced law and I practiced accounting, most of my life I was selling services. And for salespeople, you know it as well as I do, is that great salespeople have great structure to how they do things, and they absolutely have a talent for organization. We always think it's the outgoing personality. It's really not. It's the person who really understands how to make it work.
True.
For this generation, I'm going back to what I said earlier, they want to know how things work and how to make it work for them. This is a generation that has all the tools available to be very successful in this.
Right.
So one, I think we've got to overlay this concept. If you leave at 5 at night, that does not mean you're not successful.
No, that's true.
Okay.
Yeah, and by the way, I wasn't necessarily emphasizing extra hours. I was just saying that there's opportunity out there that anybody can see. We can see it. A little bit of research, look under a few stones, read a few magazines. Right. There's opportunity.
Second thing I'd like to kind of take you down a road here is, you and I have talked about this before, I believe. I have a concern that, so for instance, when I was 20 and 30, the boomer generation was 20 and 30, and there wasn't many people in front of us in a relative sense.
Yeah.
And so we got very high levels of responsibility. So I was actually Assistant Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service at age 29.
Oh my goodness.
And
you were spoiled.
I was spoiled. $1 billion budget and 100,000 employees.
Right.
That doesn't happen anymore because my generation, which is very large, still sits in most of the boxes.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for a 20 and 30-year-old in the large corporate world or large organization world to move up at the same speed that we moved up. And so one of the things we've got to think about as business leaders is we've got to restructure our management systems to be flatter and broader, to give 20 and 30-year-olds much more ability to drive, and they really are, they're the innovators and they're the creators. How do we get that up the chain and not smother them in our old chain of command systems?
Bureaucracy, so true. Yeah, we got to get rid of the hierarchy. Tom Peters talked about this 20 years ago, becoming a centerless corporation and helping companies have the administration and the technology and the money at the core and the brand at the core, but everything else out there, kind of move them out and let them stay close to the customer, because that's where the ideas emerge.
I'm always intrigued by the military in this regard, because the military understand, in the volunteer military that we have now, they have to be very good at recruiting and developing and retaining 20 and 30.
Yeah, they got a tough job.
And they're as good as anybody at it. And they've created these broad structures using technology to connect teams and groups of 20 or so in a way that we really need to do better mimicking in the private world.
That's a very interesting point. Brian, I'm going to interrupt this fantastic dialogue and talk about our sponsor. We wouldn't be here without them. We're going to come right back to you, and I'm going to segue into the conversation we're going to have right now, utilizing this as my catalyst, all right? So here we go. Good. I just want to let everybody know that this is being brought to you by Curzon Promotional Graphics here in the Omaha, Nebraska area. Excuse me, they are a full production organization with creative facilities. They've been doing it in trade shows and in signage and so on and so forth for almost 30 years. Outstanding group. They brought us this backdrop material right here. Please check out Curzon Promotional Graphics. Excuse me. Now, the graphics have to do with aesthetics. What do you think the aesthetics are in Nebraska? Do we have an opportunity there?
Well, again,
keep in mind now the younger generation we're trying to talk to.
I understand. I think the bigger issue around aesthetics is how humble we are as a state.
Okay.
I'll take a sunset at Scotts Bluff any day of the week.
Okay, well.
Okay.
I'm not going to argue with Mother Nature now.
I will take the coolness of the Haymarket in Lincoln or the Old Market in Omaha any day. Sure. I will take the experiences that, Omaha's always been is very good at design.
Right.
And what's being created downtown, and compare that to 20 years ago. The aesthetics are really good. We're much too humble about it. And we're much too humble about what we think we don't have. But I would compare our lifestyles to anywhere in the world, really.
Okay.
And I know we don't, it's hard for us to believe that as Nebraskans, but it's true.
Well, we've both been around. I was in San Francisco and Los Angeles and San Antonio, so I've seen some things, just as you have. And I came back to Nebraska and I said, there are some areas where I feel we could improve, especially in the style-conscious dimension of our lifestyle here. But I want to talk to you right now a little bit about coming back to Blueprint Nebraska. What's the next iteration? What's the next benchmark? What are we doing with the organization? And what should we be expecting over the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, so I think Blueprint Nebraska was originally designed to have a limited lifespan. And it was intended to, and is currently intended to, by June of next year, to produce 5 or 6 basic strategic themes of how do we take Nebraska and make it uber competitive against the other 50 states.
All right.
And then underneath those 5 strategies, there'll be a bunch of tactics and all that. At that point, the official mission of Blueprint will be over. But at that point, the real work begins.
Yeah, at the community level.
At the community level.
Implementation.
Because implementation in Omaha is very different than implementation in Scotts Bluff.
Yes, it is. Now, in 1 minute or less, Brian, how are you going to influence coherent, tangible, actionable implementation, community by community by community?
I think what I love about the Blueprint process and what's different than what's been done before. So even my own organization 8 years ago published a book, 100 Great Ideas for Nebraska.
Yeah.
And they were great ideas, but there was no infrastructure to execute. What we have now is 300 to 400 people. By the time it's over, there's going to be 600, 800 people involved in this process and more.
Yeah.
From all around the state who are invested in this process. Now it's much easier to go community to community because there's a handful of leaders at a minimum in every community who
And would these
touched
be
this
mostly
process.
chamber members and economic development people, and then maybe the owners of some of the larger companies in the community? I'm assuming that's the
right
group.
now. It's business leaders across the state, so most of them would be chamber members. Let's hope. But as we get into the execution phase,
Yes.
now educators, nonprofit groups, industry leaders, all sorts of people now have to be part of the process. And you've seen it, and we've got some communities that are doing great stuff in the state.
That's right.
And where it works out well is where you get all of these different interest groups in a community to come around a common strategy.
Yeah.
Now we have a strategy. How do we get those groups together? What I love about Blueprint is we've got the nucleus of the groups already involved.
I see. So you can leverage those and add on to them and lift them up. Well, this is a great thing. I can't believe that we've gotten all the way through this show because I have many more questions.
That's fine.
But you've done a wonderful job just kind of summarizing the whole thing. I think we have a feel for it now. And I want to wish you the best of luck in shepherding all these resources and smart people that are truly motivated to help you out. Including me, by the way, and we'll see what happens. But maybe you'll come back in 6 months or a year, and we'll catch up and see what the progress is.
I would love to.
That'd probably be a great show.
Thank you for doing these shows because Nebraska is a fabulous place with fabulous opportunities.
I certainly agree, and I know our viewers would as well. Thanks for watching WOWBIZ Nebraska. I'm Lynn Hinderrocker. We'll see you next time, and every single version of WOWBIZ Nebraska is going to be as good as this show right here. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.